Iran Daily Briefing. Friday, April the 17th, 2026. A 10-day ceasefire between Lebanon and Israel took effect at midnight local time this morning, and within hours, the Lebanese army was already reporting alleged violations along the southern border. Meanwhile, U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth stood at the Pentagon podium and directed a message straight at Tehran. What he said and how he said it matters. We'll get to that in full. The ceasefire that came into force this morning is the most significant pause in the Lebanon-Israel conflict since US and Israeli military operations against Iran began on February the 28th. President Trump announced the deal and invited both countries' leaders to the White House. But a ceasefire announced is not a ceasefire secured. And today's early reports of violations are the first test of whether it holds. At the same time, a separate diplomatic thread is developing in Europe. The Allied meeting convened by France and the UK took place today, per Al Monitor, to consider deploying a multinational force to the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran has largely closed to non-Iranian shipping since late February. A note on today's sourcing before we go further. All of today's intelligence items carry moderate confidence levels. That means we report what sources say, and we flag where corroboration is missing. The 2,000 casualty figure you'll hear in a moment comes from a single Al Jazeera report and has not been independently confirmed. Hold it accordingly. Here's what we're covering today: the ceasefire and the violation reports, Hegseth's direct message to Tehran, the Strait of Hormuz Allied meeting, and a diplomatic signal about who brokered this deal and how. The 10-day Lebanon-Israel ceasefire is the headline, but the details around it deserve careful attention. France 24 and Middle East Eye report the ceasefire took effect at midnight local time on April 17th. The leaders of Israel and Lebanon agreed to the pause in fighting, NPR confirms. President Trump announced the deal and said he has invited both countries' leaders to the White House for further talks, according to France 24. That same day, France 24 reports the Lebanese army filed reports of several alleged violations in the southern border region. The party responsible for the alleged violations was not identified in the sources available to this briefing. Early violation reports on the first day of a ceasefire are not unusual in this region, but they are worth watching closely. If violations accumulate and go unaddressed, they erode the credibility of the agreement itself. Now to the Pentagon. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth held a press briefing today, and DoD News reports two things he said that stand out. First, he urged what he called the new Iranian regime to make wise choices. DoD News reported Hegseth used the phrase without elaboration in the available transcript. Second, he called on Iran to work in good faith toward a deal with the United States. Both statements came in the context of the ceasefire in combat operations, the pause in the active fighting that this 10-day agreement now formalizes. Also at the Pentagon today, Air Force General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, per DoD News, separately thanked sailors and Marines for enforcing a blockade of ships sailing from Iranian ports in the Persian Gulf. That blockade is a U.S. military operation running alongside and in response to Iran's own closure of the Strait of Hormuz to non-Iranian shipping. So what you have today is this: a ceasefire is in place, but U.S. military pressure on Iranian shipping continues. Hegseth is publicly calling on Tehran to engage. The Lebanese army is already logging potential violations. The forward-looking thing to watch: whether Lebanon and Israel's leaders respond to Trump's White House invitation. And when. Story 1. The Strait of Hormuz and the Allied meeting. Al Monitor reports that French President Emmanuel Macron and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer chaired the Allied meeting convened by France and the UK today, April 17th, to consider sending a multinational force to the Strait of Hormuz. As we've covered this week, Iran imposed its closure of the strait as soon as US and Israeli operations began on February 28th. Al Monitor confirms it has remained largely closed to non-Iranian ships since then. The Allied meeting today represents the most direct multilateral response yet to that closure. Whether it results in a formal decision to deploy forces and which nations would contribute has not been reported in today's available sources. Watch for any communique or announcement coming out of that Allied meeting in the next 24 hours. Story 2. Trump calls the war. A little diversion. Al Jazeera, Middle East reports that US President Donald Trump described the war on Iran, which Al Jazeera says has killed more than 2,000 people, as a little diversion. That characterization, reported by Al Jazeera, stands in notable tension with the scale of the military operations underway and with Hegseth's simultaneous message calling for Iranian engagement. The 2,000 death figure comes from Al Jazeera alone and has not been corroborated by other sources in today's reporting. Treat it as unverified pending confirmation. Watch for whether other outlets pick up and confirm or contest the casualty figures cited by Al Jazeera. Story 3. Who brokered the ceasefire? Here is one of the more significant diplomatic details to come out of today's reporting. Middle East Eye reports that Hezbollah lawmaker Ibrahim al-Musawi gave an interview to Anadolu Agency in which he said the Lebanon-Israel ceasefire deal was reached, in his words, under Iranian pressure, Pakistani efforts and Saudi cooperation. That is a direct claim from inside Hezbollah's political wing that Iran played an active role in pushing for this ceasefire. If accurate, it complicates the picture of Iran as a purely combative party. It suggests Tehran was also working diplomatic levers to bring the fighting to a pause. Separately, Middle East Eye reports that Iranian Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf met with Pakistan's Army Chief Asim Munir in Tehran on April 16th, the day before the ceasefire took effect. The content of the Ghalibaf-Munir meeting has not been confirmed in today's reporting. Watch for whether Iran, Pakistan or Saudi Arabia issues any official statement about their respective roles in brokering this ceasefire. Story 4. Iranian academic faces US deportation. Al-Monitor reports that the Trump administration said on April 16th it is attempting to deport Iranian academic and media commentator Yusuf Azizi, alleging he lied on his visa application. No further detail on the legal process or timeline was available in today's reporting. Watch for any legal response or court filing in the Azizi case in the coming days. We opened this morning with the ceasefire and Hegseth's message to Tehran. Here is the fuller picture. The 10-day ceasefire took effect at midnight local time on April 17th per Middle East Eye. Lebanon and Israel's leaders agreed to it. President Trump announced it and issued White House invitations. The Lebanese army reported alleged violations on the same day it took effect. The party behind those alleged violations was not named in available sources. At the Pentagon, Hegseth addressed Iran directly, calling on Tehran to engage in good faith toward a deal and urging what he called the new Iranian regime to make wise choices. General Keynes separately acknowledged that US forces are actively maintaining a blockade of Iranian port traffic in the Persian Gulf, and a Hezbollah lawmaker told Anadolu Agency that Iran itself helped bring this ceasefire into existence. That is the picture as of today. A pause in the fighting, continued military and economic pressure on Iran, and a US call for diplomatic engagement, all happening simultaneously. Several specific things to track in the next 24 to 48 hours. First, the ceasefire clock. The 10-day ceasefire took effect at midnight local time this morning, April 17th. That means it runs through the morning of April 27th. The Lebanese Army's Day 1 violation reports make the next 48 hours particularly important. Patterns established early tend to define whether a ceasefire holds or fractures. Second, the Allied meeting outcome. The meeting convened by France and the UK took place today. Any communique, joint statement or operational announcement about a Strait of Hormuz multinational force could come in the hours or days immediately following. Third, Hegseth's call for Iranian engagement. DoD News reports he called on Iran to work in good faith toward a deal with the United States. Whether Tehran responds, and through what channel, is the next data point to watch. Hegseth said Iran should engage in good faith. That is what the record shows as of today. Fourth, the White House invitations. Trump invited both Israeli and Lebanese leaders to Washington for further talks. Whether either side formally accepts and how quickly will signal how seriously both parties are treating this pause. And finally, the Azizi deportation case. The Trump administration's move, reported by Al Monitor on April 16th, may produce a legal response or public statement in the next news cycle. Today's episode covered the 10-day Lebanon-Israel ceasefire and Day 1 violation reports, Defense Secretary Hegseth's call for Iranian engagement, the Allied meeting convened by France and the UK on the Strait of Hormuz, the diplomatic claim that Iran helped broker the ceasefire, and the US move to deport Iranian academic Yusuf Azizi. A note on today's episode. One available intelligence item, FIFA. President Gianni Infantino's statement that Iran would participate in the 2026 World Cup was reviewed and set aside. With the ceasefire, Allied military coordination, and direct US-Iran diplomatic signaling all breaking today, the FIFA item did not meet the threshold for inclusion in a briefing of this length. It remains on file. We'll be back tomorrow with the latest. If you found today's briefing valuable, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. New episodes every morning.